Thank you very much. Here I am, standing in front of you, here to confess how deeply I love science fiction. As you've heard, I have a right hand. On my right hand, I am Professor of 19th Century Literature and Culture. That's my actual job description at Royal Holloway, which is part of the University of London. My PhD was on Robert Browning and the classics. I teach and I love poetry. Poetry moves me. It inspires me. It's one of the great passions of my life. But here on my left hand, I love science fiction. It sounds a bit like a sort of Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but it's nothing but the truth. I love science fiction with a love that goes deeper even than my love for poetry. And what I want to do today, in the 14 minutes that remain to me, is to suggest you have the wrong idea about what science fiction is. In fact, most of the people I know in the science fiction community, including people who write science fiction, have the wrong idea about what science fiction is. And that science fiction and poetry are the same thing. It's not that they're alike. It's not that they have things in common. It's not that it's compatible to like science fiction on the one hand and poetry on the other. It is that they are the same thing. And I'm going to make that argument here today with a little potted history of science fiction and some talk about Greek warriors and lions and this and that. But I'd just like to reiterate before I get going on that, I really love science fiction. It's a tremendous thing. I love it as much as my 4-year-old son loves science fiction, although I'm less likely to go running at people with my head down shouting, "Hulk smash," but only because it's frowned upon by polite society. I'm not quite sure why that should be. My love for poetry probably exceeds my son's, unless you count Hulk smash as poetry, which I suppose, in a sense, it can be. People think of science fiction as extrapolated science. They think of it as nerdy and geeky. And most of the people I know who write science fiction have backgrounds in the sciences. They did science degrees, often science PhDs. It's very popular amongst scientists. There's nothing wrong with that. But to go back to the video that we saw at the start of this session, with the speaker whose name I've now forgotten, looked like a slightly chunky Ken Branagh. Very good, very funny. It's interesting that the arts, which is where my educational background is looked down upon, and nowhere is that more acutely true than in science fiction. I'm not equipped intellectually, in terms of that knowledge base, to get at the heart of science in the fullest sense, because my head is full of poetry. But I don't think that's a problem. I grew up reading science fiction, and this is my potted history of the genre for your benefit. And when I was a nipper, a little kid, and even a medium kid, and then a big kid, which is where I am now, after all. The sort of science fiction I read, classic golden age science fiction from the 1950s and 1960s. We're talking about writers like Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Philip K. Dick, great thinkers who worked in what was a literature of ideas, who came up with mind-blowing concepts and intellectual, brain-stretching thoughts. Particularly Philip K. Dick. He's an unfortunate writer to teach, as I have done, because there's simply no way of talking about his achievement without saying the word dick a lot. And no, you're too mature to giggle at that, but you'd be surprised how much giggling can be produced by 18-year-olds listening to a man in his mid-40s saying dick a lot. Philip K. Dick, I think, was a philosopher. He wasn't trained classically, but he had genuinely deep thoughts about the nature of reality. He played thought experiments out in his short stories and his novels. And I think that's true of all those great writers. And it's as a literature of ideas, I think, that scientists tend to love science fiction. It's as a literature of ideas that people think of it. It's just they think of those ideas as being rather forbidding. It used to be the case that that's what science fiction was. Science fiction is different now. If I say to people, I love science fiction, they will say, oh. Or they'll say, oh, yes, I used to like science fiction myself when I was a teenager. Obviously, I've grown up since then. Or they perhaps won't be so brutal in the way that they confront me with this fact of the world. I'll say, so you don't read science fiction? No. Do you see science fiction? Well, obviously, I watch Doctor Who. Everybody watches Doctor Who. And I went to see Avatar. Everyone wants to see Avatar. But I don't like science fiction. I'm thinking, how can this be? The thing that happened that changed science fiction was Star Wars. 1977, when I was 12 years old, I bunked off school to see this film. If any of my old teachers are here today, I'm sorry, what can I say? I saw it 3 times in the first week that it emerged. I loved it. It opened my eyes. It's not much liked in the world of science fiction criticism, which is one of the worlds I move in, because it's silly. On the level of content, it is derivative. The script is very badly written. The characters are two-dimensional. But it is, I think, a great work of art, not because of its content, not because of its ideas, but because of its look, because of its design, because of its special effects, because it has the most evil man in the world living inside a gigantic black plastic clam, because of its emotional affect, because it can move you, as this ancient story, which comes originally from the Norman conquest, of finding out who Luke Skywalker's father really is. Star Wars was an enormous success. For a while, it was the highest grossing motion picture of all time. It's lost that title now. Now that is Avatar that is the highest grossing film of all time. And that's not coincidental. This is the shift. This is what's changed science fiction. If you draw up a list of the top 20 grossing films of all time, which I've deliberately put in fonts slightly too small for you to be able to see so that you can't challenge my assertion here. But my assertion is, of those 20, 19 are science fiction or fantasy. The top grossing film, of course, is Avatar. The second highest grossing film, Titanic, also directed by James Cameron, but otherwise it's all Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Pirates of the Caribbean, big budget, spectacular, exciting films that embody a mode of visual poetry that entirely overwhelms the fact that almost all of them are very bad stories. I notice this is quite a recent development, the Transformers Dark of the Moon, which on the level of story and character may be the worst film ever made, is nonetheless the 4th highest grossing film of all time because it looks stunning. Let me explain why I think this is true. This explains the presence of Titanic in that list, actually, because what Titanic gives its audiences are the same satisfactions, the same sense of wonder, the same scale and mind-blowing visual poetry that you find in Avatar or Star Wars or any of these other films. And this has to do with metaphor, and this is what's going to bring me back round to poetry. So bear with me whilst I get a little bit technical. There you have Achilles, who's a Greek warrior, and there you have a lion, a small lion, living in a tiny little box. But he's happy in there, just as I'm happy standing on what looks like a giant goth flag of Japan. It's just the environment you find yourself in. There's no problem with that. Aristotle defines a metaphor as a way of talking about something that moves you beyond the ordinary limits of how you think about that thing. If you say Achilles is a lion, on the one hand you're saying Achilles is very brave and very ferocious. He's a sort of warrior you need to be scared of. He will kill you in the same way that a lion will kill you. But you're doing more than that, I think, and this is at the heart of what science fiction can do. Because science fiction is a mode of art that represents the world without reproducing it. Science fiction is a metaphorical mode of art, and it's in its metaphors. It's in that process by which it comes up with a new way of thinking about the mundane realities of life that leaps us out of what we're expecting. It's a sort of conceptual knight's move that takes you someplace new. It always seems to me when I read that passage in which Aristotle talks about Achilles and the lion, that it does more than simply stress the ferocity or the bravery of Achilles. It sort of creates a weird, monstrous, rather beautiful man-lion hybrid that haunts the imaginarium as you think about these things. So I think that this is how poetry works at its best. It makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck because it makes you think about ordinary things in a new way that is exciting, that is powerful. And it does that through metaphor. Metaphor is the action of poetry. But metaphor is also the language of visual science fiction, the science fiction which has come to dominate visual culture, science fiction and fantasy more broadly conceived. If I'm asked to define science fiction, which is a famously thorny and difficult thing to do, I will usually say, well, the platonic form of science fiction for me is the bone that the ape who has been playing on the African savannah throws up into the sky. And the camera follows the bone all the way up until almost at the top of its trajectory. And then suddenly, beautifully, I think, amazingly, movingly, it's in a way that's hard to rationalize, in a way that isn't extrapolated logically from science, but in a way that is very powerful. It turns into a spaceship. That is the classic move, I think, of science fiction. That's what science fiction does to my head. And it does it in the way that poetry does it as well. And that's the motion beyond. That's how we describe it rhetorically, formally. That's what a metaphor is. It's a way of taking your mind into some new space. And I don't think science fiction really is best judged on the level of content. I think it's best judged on the level of form, of those poetic moments and images. And some of the greatest art that's been produced in the last half century has embodied that. The moment at the beginning of The Matrix. And The Matrix is a film with intellectual pretensions. It thinks it's a philosophical disquisition on the nature of appearance and reality, and it's all right in a sort of sophomoric, derivative way. But as a visual work of art, I think it is very profound. When Carrie-Anne Moss leaps up and then freezes in midair and the camera swoops around her, it's not just that it's Carrie-Anne Moss wearing a tight leather outfit that makes me think this is a very beautiful moment. When the twin suns set over Tatooine, it's exquisite. A star child arrives at the end of 2001. It speaks volumes in a way that cannot be reduced to the rational idiom of which naturally and properly science masters. And this is why I think science fiction is a rather bad name, actually, for what it is that I love, and certainly what it is that my 4-year-old son loves. He's less interested in rational extrapolation from contemporary scientific ideas. He's more interested in the rush, the excitement. He's interested in being moved. He's interested in turning into an enormous, green, smashing machine, as are we all, on some level. It's very hard to take a 4-year-old boy round a toy shop and pick up a toy lightsaber without going, you see middle-aged men doing it all the time. And that's the point at which I start thinking, this is how we should think of science fiction. It is something that precisely moves us beyond what we expect about the world. It finds eloquent and powerful metaphors to talk us through our own experience. And I think that's all I need to say about it, actually. So I shall sit down now. But thank you for bearing with me. And I shall click on there. And I'm back to Adam Roberts.
Thanks, Adam Roberts. Thank you.